While poetry is always one of our most powerful means of articulating the meaning and mystery of life, it seems that in moments of crisis, in times of acute uncertainty, even in the midst of tragedy, poetry shines all the brighter and has the power to gather us like around a fire at night, where the words glow with hope and warmth, where the fragments of truth that poetry reveals flicker and spark. Precise, bright words, like shards of light against a blanket of darkness. And so I know I'm not alone in finding myself during this time of global pandemic turning to poetry and to the particular way that poetry helps to make meaning. I'm reminded that our word poetry comes from the Greek poesis, which means simply to make. One way that I've heard it put in terms of what it is that poetry makes is that poetry uses words to weave a basket, and that the basket that it weaves is able to hold that which words cannot say, a basket that holds the wordless wonder of life. This week, I invite you to admire and meditate with me on a well-made basket of words that was woven back in 1860. Poem number 236 by Emily Dickinson. Some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home, with a bobolink for a chorister and an orchard for a dome. Some keep the Sabbath in surplice. I just wear my wings. And instead of tolling the bell for church, our little sexton sings. God preaches, a noted clergyman, and the sermon is never long. So instead of getting to heaven at last, I'm going all along. In this strange time of sheltering in place, this well-loved poem has perhaps never been more pertinent, or has perhaps never spoken so directly to the moment. As we all find ourselves now in this place of trying to learn from this poet who is famous for being a hermit and a recluse, as we try to learn from her the art of keeping the Sabbath by staying at home, as she puts it. Emily Dickinson began her famous self-imposed quarantine in her Amherst, Massachusetts home about a year before writing this poem. And she would go on to spend the last 2 decades of her life, creating some of the most innovative and timeless poetry from the comfort of her bedroom. Legend has it that she would speak with her visitors through her closed door, that she would give treats to children in her neighborhood by way of lowering a basket out of her second-story window, even that she listened to her father's at-home funeral service from the privacy of her bedroom, with her ear pressed up against the door. Yet this was also the most creative time period for this poet, when she wrote the majority of her nearly 2,000 poems, including this one, which was one of only 7 that she published during her lifetime. Some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home. On first read, or on superficial glance maybe, it can seem as if the poet might be critiquing the idea of worshiping in a church. But in fact, I think there's nothing negative said about church as such here. And I hear in this poem, instead of critique, I hear celebration. A celebration of the sacred in nature, a celebration of the earth as sanctuary, of the orchard as cathedral, of the bird song as its own hymn of praise, the bobolink chorus as no less glorious than the Hallelujah chorus. And above all, I hear this poem as a celebration of Sabbath. Sabbath as that foundational cornerstone idea that runs throughout the Bible, that anchors the Jewish and Christian understanding of worship and spiritual practice. Sabbath in terms of how theologian and philosopher Abraham Joshua Heschel described it as a sanctuary in time. He wrote about how some religions focus their sense of the sacred on space, on spatial reality. For example, in building large and impressive buildings or monuments, or focusing on certain sacred geographical sites. But the biblical imagination, he argued, invites us to focus more on time, with Sabbath being like a sanctuary in time, with Sabbath being whenever we find ourselves attuned to holiness in time, with Sabbath being when we face the moments given to us as sacred moments, with Sabbath when we ask ourselves maybe not so much where is God, but when is God, and with Sabbath being when we recognize that the when of God is always now, with Sabbath being when we rest and delight in the eternal now of God. Sabbath in this sense can be thought of as a foretaste or as a glimpse, a preview of the world to come or of the world perfected. Sabbath as a glimpse into heaven, which is why the Bible has pretty radical recommendations. Things like forgiving debts on the Sabbath, freeing the enslaved on the Sabbath, letting the earth rest and renew. That's why more often than not, the healing miracles of Jesus were said to have been taken place on the Sabbath. Sabbath is supposed to offer us a glimpse into heaven, because on the Sabbath, all injustices are to be restored. On the Sabbath, as it were, injustice itself takes a holiday. If the world perfected, if heaven is like that, I've heard it put that we should really take this keeping the Sabbath business pretty seriously. Because if we don't practice and become familiar with Sabbath in this life, then we'll have no clue what to do with ourselves in the life that is to come. Sabbath as a glimpse, a foretaste. Sabbath maybe as a moment in which we tune in to the poetry of creation and listen in on God's sermon, which in the end is a short sermon, really. One which our reclusive, master at keeping the Sabbath at home poet once heard when she opened her bedroom window and listened to the birds singing in the treetop canopy. And with words, she made a basket for us, one that holds the wordless mystery of finding oneself resting and delighting in the eternal now of God. Poem number 236 by Emily Dickinson. Some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home, with a bobolink for a chorister and an orchard for a dome. Some keep the Sabbath in surplice. I just wear my wings, and instead of tolling the bell for church, our little sexton sings. God preaches, a noted clergyman, and the sermon is never long. So instead of getting to heaven at last, I'm going all along.